Hey everybody, if we haven't met yet, if you're a parent, a new student, or if you're someone that just happened upon this channel, my name is Hannah Tinky and I am the junior high female coordinator for First Pres of Greenville. And in this kind of crazy unknown time, when we're all kind of secluded and off on our own, we've decided to start this online series through social media, through YouTube, through Instagram, and just different technologies to continue growing and to continue studying the Word and being able to just teach and learn more about Jesus instead of just sitting and not doing anything and binge watching and doing all of this stuff that we could do. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but I am saying that I think in a time like this, when we're typically busy, I think the Lord really wants us to utilize this time to grow and to bind together in faith. And that's something we're going to be talking about today in Galatians 2. So Charlie made a video for us yesterday, and he talked about really like what Galatians is, who wrote the book of Galatians, when that happened, and the purpose of writing the letter. And those are all things that are extremely important to reading scripture because context is key. We've talked about that a little bit with our Roots family, with junior high and senior high students, just about, the fact that if you're reading through scripture and you don't really know who wrote that particular book or why or to whom and all those things, then it's going to be really hard to understand really what the original context is and what the original author is saying, because that's the whole point of reading scripture, is to know what the original intention is, as opposed to, okay, well, what is it saying to me? Because a lot of times that means that we're taking it out of context and we're trying to just apply scripture to our lives now and not really learning what God intentionally meant through it. And God can use scripture at any time, but in order to read scripture and read the Bible in really what it means is to go back and to see what the original author intended for the original audience. And we talked about that a little bit yesterday. If you haven't watched Charlie's video yet, I would encourage you to go ahead and just pause this and to go back and watch Charlie's video from yesterday, because it really sets the tone for what we're going to be reading today and how we're reading it. So, like I said, we're going to be in Galatians chapter 2. So if you flip in your Jesus Bible, if you have that with you today, it's going to be on page 1816. That is the first page of the book of Galatians. You might have to flip a little bit to find Galatians chapter 2. But to give you kind of an outline, I won't sit here and read the entire thing. It's only 21 verses, so it's not too long, and I think it's a relatively easy read, but it's very hefty. There's a lot to it, and in order to really understand what you're reading in chapter 2, you have to read chapter 1. So I think it was one of my professors that actually told me this. When you're reading a letter, like let's just say in real life, like my younger brother was in boot camp about 4-ish years ago, and we wrote letters to each other. Well, when you read a letter, you don't typically read like the first paragraph and then set it down and then like a couple days later read the next one. Like normally when you get a letter, you read the entire thing all together because it helps you better understand like the entire letter and its purpose. So if you just pull a chapter out of a random book, it's going to be really hard to know the entire purpose, and you might get really confused really easily. So I'd encourage you to go back and read chapter 1 as well. So chapter 2, let's go ahead and get started. So what Paul is doing here, what we talked about and what we know to be true, is that he's talking to the churches in Galatia. So there's a couple different theories on that. Charlie touched on that yesterday. Doesn't change the text a ton, but it does let us know really who he's talking to. And so he explains to them this issue of, okay, we have Jews and we have Gentiles, and we have this church that's bringing them together and unifying them, and that's something that's really exciting and really good and from the Lord. But we have this heresy that's happening, and this false gospel that we're learning about, which means it's something that's coming from people who think that they know what truth is, but it's really not true. And it's causing people to conform to that and like kind of just guarding and like blinding their eyes to what the true gospel is. And in this case, what he's talking about is circumcision and eating and a couple different issues that they have in their law at that time in history. And so Paul wants to kind of lay the ground and level it and say, no, this is what Christ says. And Christ says that it doesn't matter if you're a Jew or if you're a Gentile. It doesn't matter because he has no prejudice, he has no partiality or any of those things. Really what sets the tone for salvation and creates this playing field for you to be able to attain righteousness. It's not because of your like who you are, or if you're circumcised or not, or if you eat this meat or not. The way that you're able to attain salvation and unity with Christ is through faith only. It's through Jesus. And if there's anything tacked on to that concept, if it's Jesus plus whatever, again, something we talked about yesterday, if it's Jesus plus whatever, then it's wrong. It's false. That is not what the gospel explains. And so he goes through, it's really verses 1 through about 14, where he explains all this to the church of Galatia and or the churches in Galatia, and says to them, hey, listen, like this is what is being taught to you, and this is why it's wrong. And so he's correcting them, and he's telling them, and another part of a lot of times what Paul's letters are about is encouraging, trying to build up the church and encourage those who are believers, instructing them on what to do and helping them understand really what the point of their faith is, and correcting them. So right now he's in the middle of correcting them and saying like, hey, people have been telling you this, but it's really not true. I'll tell you what's true, and it's the gospel. So if you drop down into verses 15 through 21, this is really, he like sums everything up, sums the chapter up in this particular passage. And it can be kind of confusing. I remember reading through this, especially verses 20 through 21, where it says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. That didn't really make sense to me. For a long time, I remember reading that when I was younger and being really confused by that. And like, what does that mean? Well, I can answer this for you. And then I really would love for you guys to study this and to write down questions. And I would challenge you to journal as well and just write out, what does this teach me about God? What does this teach me about who he is and who Jesus is? And those types of questions. But I also want you to dig through this particular part, because it's talking about how we're justified. And this justified word, this is in Galatians 2, it's one of the first times that the word justified is used, which is kind of crazy. But justified, to give you like a better idea, it means to declare righteousness. And so to sum up this video really quick, because I know it's getting long, but to sum up this video, what Paul is trying to say here, and to kind of make sense of this summary in the last part of Galatians chapter 2, he's saying that people are going to tell you that it's Jesus and works, Jesus and the law. But what he's saying is you can be justified, and you will be justified in salvation through faith in Jesus alone. So when you break the law, So back in the day when Jews or Gentiles or anyone broke the law, what that meant is death. Like, it resulted in death. But what Paul is saying is that Jesus died so that you don't have to be righteous through the law anymore. All you have to do is come to salvation and faith through Jesus. And so there's grace that he also talks about, and he's saying, I don't want to forget about grace. Like, grace is huge in this. And what it means is God is giving people something that they don't deserve. He's allowing that to happen and giving that to them as a gift. And so if righteousness was attained by works or the law, if the only way that you would have salvation was through works or through something that you did so that you could reach this goal, then Jesus died for nothing. There was no point. There was no reason for him to die. But what Paul is saying here to the people in Galatia is that you don't have to say, okay, I have to follow this law, and I have to be saved through faith, and I have to do this and that and that. Like, there's so many things that people are trying to add on to salvation in Jesus. But the exciting thing is that Jesus is enough. And so that's what Paul is saying in Galatians chapter 2. So again, I would encourage you to just journal and pray over this passage as we go through Galatians. This was a tiny, tiny little summary and snippet of what these passages really are. And so I'd encourage you to dig through them, ask God what he's really saying and what Paul is saying in this letter to the churches of Galatia. So make sure to continue along in the coming weeks as we go through Galatians and Ephesians next week. We've got some really cool things planned for you guys, and feel free to reach out to us through Instagram, text us, email us, FaceTime us, whatever you want to do so we can answer some questions for you if you have any. And be on the lookout for our playlist, which is on Spotify. It's available there. We're adding worship songs so we can worship along with you in this time of waiting. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you guys soon.